into this session that I'll be talking about current food standards issues with you. What I've tried to do is pick out what I think are the current issues that are likely to have an impact on trading standards and business. If someone isn't on mute, would you mind just going on to mute, please? Because I can hear quite a bit of background noise there. That's okay. Thanks. Yeah, what I've tried to do is pick out some issues that I think are likely to have an impact on us over the next few months, both kind of, from a regulator and business point of view, as well as other relevant parties. So if there is something that you think I've missed, quite happy to take questions later on. As you may have heard myself and Adam talking, if a question comes to mind and you just want to make a note of it in the chat box, unfortunately, I can't actually see the chat box, but Adam will monitor that, and then we can answer the questions if it's relevant as we're going along. But if not, I can sort of gather them together at the end when I take the presentation down. If I can't answer, or if I can't, or if I don't know, or if I can't answer, then what we'll do is questions away and we'll see the answers when I've had a look into it and hopefully come up with an answer that will help you. So, let's say the idea of today is really just to provide information and raise issues that you may or may not be aware of. And if there is something that I kind of say and you think actually that isn't quite as I understood it, then by all means join in via the chat box and we can talk about it. So there's a kind of lot happening. What I've tried to do, or what I've done, is just broken the presentation down into kind of three areas of topic. First one is COVID-19, so talk about issues around that. Next issue is the post-EU exit transition period, which of course will come to an end on the 31st of December this year. And then there's some other issues, some of them have been bubbling around for a while. Some of them are reasonably recent, but I just thought I'd mention a few of them just so that you're aware, and also hopefully provide some possible avenues that they can be either talked about or discussed or resolved in the processes that you can go through to do that. So, okay, so we'll start with COVID-19. Topical, because obviously the new lockdown, sorry about the noise, topical because of the new lockdown period, which is starting today, has a number of impacts indirectly on certainly trading standards and environmental health officers' work. The kind of indirect or direct impact is that many officers are being pulled away to carry out duties and enforcement issues around COVID-19 business closures mainly. And although from a trading standards aspect of it, that aspect of the work dropped off a little bit during the summer months. I know that quite a lot of it, because it related to more of the kind of social distancing issues, fell a bit more heavily mental health colleagues who were from the kind of health and safety aspect of it. But now we're back into businesses needing to be closed. We'll be kind of dealing with those, and again, I think some of the resource will be pulled away to deal with that. So the FSA have recognised, and really from, I guess, part way through or near the beginning of the previous lockdown in March, the FSA began to realise, I think, that the work was having an impact on the potential resource that could be put into food work, and they have issued or started to issue guidance. That guidance has developed into a series of questions and answers. And if you, I would hope that most of you can access the Smarter Comms platform, because the documentation relating to that is on there. And I think it's really important for particularly food lead officers to be aware of what that guidance is telling us, because my understanding is that the FSA, the kind of lames return won't be as it has been for previous years. And also I'll be talking later on about the kind of final transition period exit from the EU, but there is something around that as well, maybe lanes not being the kind of required reporting mechanism, but COVID-19, the situation around it, I think has meant that the FSA have realised that the level of activity relating to food, both standards and hygiene work, has fallen, and the additional requirement to kind of report and then prepare the return is one that many authorities will be struggling with, and the level of activity is such that, you know, it will be, I suspect, considerably lower than previous years. So the FSA have said that they will be gathering data around activity via a survey rather than the more traditional lanes return. But all the details are in the documents on the Smarter Comms platform. I can't remember which version of the question and answer we're up to now, but it's been constantly updated. And there was a communication that came out a few days ago, basically referring back to the expectation letter that went out in September. And the letter is quite helpful because it does provide fairly detailed guidance around what the expectation from the FSA is around activity, both relating to standards and hygiene. So, you know, it's worth definitely being aware of that, because that is the framework that the FSA will be using to gather activity data via the survey. So there may well be kind of reporting codes and slightly different aspects of that you may want to or already have hopefully incorporated into the recording system. So that's kind of where we are with that. The main guidance, I think, is talking about really, I think, being aware of, I'll talk a little bit later on about the kind of impact, but you know, it's really being aware of what food businesses are doing, because clearly there has been a significant impact on the market sector. So one of the big aspects is obviously looking at the high priority businesses, but that could be affected fairly rapidly by what happens and what steps they take to deal with the situation that they're in. So I think what the FSA are saying is that really local authorities should be identifying, you know, where the potential higher risk issues are, and then they'll be gathering information about what we've done to deal with those. So some of the issues that I talk about shortly will have a kind of input into what the kind of risk and what the work program potentially looks like. And I just think that, unlike previous years, because of the reasonably constant shifting situation, the kind of risk isn't set in stone anymore. It will keep shifting, and I think it's trying to be as flexible and around dealing with, and you know, the idea of having a kind of set bag of maybe high risk, medium, whatever risk premises, businesses to look at, that has been overtaken slightly by the situation. So the other aspect of it is that the FSA have said that, you know, depending on the situation, and I think relying on officers' skill and professional judgment, really, remote interventions can play a part in this. So there's something about, you know, how you look at what the business is doing via various sources. It isn't just a reliance on that kind of face-to-face physical visit. So I think what they're saying is that depending on the situation in, you know, your area, and I guess the potential risks that may be involved in a kind of face-to-face visit, there can be a look at what the potential risk is from other sources. So it could be a website, could be through sampling, could be through complaints, could be through other sources of data or information. So I think it's an opportunity to maybe look at these different ways of doing things. And, you know, when the COVID-19 situation ends, it may well be that, you know, if we find some of these things work, we could maybe incorporate them into into the way we work so that we can maybe not be so reliant upon physical visits. Physical visits are always, have always got to be an option, but there may be other ways we can do things, and it's a chance to kind of have a look at them. The COVID-19 situation has also resulted in, certainly during the first kind of lockdown, it resulted in fairly difficult food supply chain issues, particularly relating to the hospitality sector, where supply chains that have been around for years, just been operating, very efficiently, suddenly the supply chain was interrupted, and what it meant was that many businesses ended up with food that was being supplied via contract, or hospitality outlets were just turning around and saying, well, actually, we don't need that anymore. So the wholesaler or the distribution chain was then left to deal with lots of supply of food, which wasn't really produced for the retail market. So there was a move around enabling food businesses to try to avoid as much food waste as we could, to try to get that food into the retail chain. So there was a guidance note, and there was help around that food information flexibility. And I know certainly from some of the primary authority companies that we've kind of dealt with where I am, they did find that really helpful, really useful, and it was a way of trying to avoid as much food waste as we could, really. So, and that flexibility kind of ended, I think it's kind of ended July, but I don't know this time what's going to happen, but I guess we'll be looking at the situation, and if there is a need for that to be maybe reintroduced, it's something that we can keep an eye on, and talk to the FSA if we are getting issues or problems with the interrupted supply chain. Because again, I get the impression, certainly looking at things, that the supply chains had just started to become reinvigorated, and then obviously there were kind of local lockdowns and different levels of controls in different areas. But I think the national lockdown and what that meant for particularly the hospitality to come as a little bit of a kind of bolt out of the blue. So I suspect there may well be potential supply chain issues in the system that may well start to kind of come out in the next few days, potentially a week or so. So I think it's just a case of keeping an eye on that and feeding any issues and difficulties back to the FSA and DEFRA, and talking to them about what can be done, really. Looking at things longer term, and I know we've gone into another lockdown, so it's kind of difficult to gauge this, but you're kind of wondering what will happen once we do get to a position where things do return to something like we would previously call normal, and what the food will look like when it happens. We've already seen a number of food businesses going out of business. Impact on the hospitality sector I've already mentioned, and I think potentially there could be issues around that, and it has a number of kind of impacts on local authorities. Clearly, from a local authority point of view, local authorities want businesses that are able to thrive and grow, so there will be issues around that economic problem within local areas where businesses have gone out of business, both from national chains but also smaller local businesses as well. So from a regulatory point of view, clearly there are also potential issues around that, because it's happening already, and it happened during previous lockdown, but businesses will and have been able to diversify, and I think quite a few of them did it quite quickly. From the hospitality point of view, that did cause issues around where you were suddenly moving from table service to delivery, and there were kind of potential issues around, I think in particular, we were concerned about allergen issues, provision of allergen information, where, maybe the system that the business had got was able to work pretty well for table service and potentially, some lower levels of orders by telephone or people just kind of walking in and ordering. Certainly there was a sector, a part of the hospitality industry or sector where, they weren't really geared towards providing that information in a way that was appropriate. So, potentially there were issues around that. And I think it is where the businesses diversify that potentially there are going to be issues. And it's something that, if we can be aware of, and it is trying to get as much information out there as we can so that at least businesses can access that. And, wherever possible, provide support for them to be able to do that. And quite a few, other food businesses, started looking at different delivery models, which always takes a bit of time. And it'll be interesting to see with this lockdown how many how many restaurants kind of start to look at that delivery side of things again. And you do wonder if when we move forward, potentially there will be fewer businesses, but also there may well be fewer businesses, but they could be delivering food to consumers in slightly different ways. And, the kind of, I'll talk about the aggregators as they're called later on, so Just Eat and Deliveroo, people like that. But again, they have probably done, they've been okay, I think, because they probably had an increase in business during this. And though I kind of hesitate to use, the phrase people have done okay, but certainly the retail food shops have been very busy. And so in terms of their turnover, I guess that has not really been as badly hit as the restaurants who have been made to close down. Current situation is, as I understand it, takeaways can still serve and deliver after certain times. The rules are not as easy to understand as perhaps they could be. So I think there will be something around businesses maybe not quite being clear about what the requirements are. So again, it's something that can be a source of support, and obviously as we're the ones who will be potentially enforcing those particular rules as well as the police, then that's a role for us with regard to that. The regulation and economic recovery, I think it is, and I think I've kind of touched upon the fact that businesses in certain sectors have been quite badly hit, and you can't help but feel that there will be a tension between the level of regulation and the economic recovery. Because say local authorities, central government want businesses to be able to get back into and hopefully grow business. So in terms of regulation, will there be, and I don't know, so this is just speculation really, will there be pressure maybe to perhaps look at ways that we can ease regulation in certain areas, or maybe have a lighter touch around certain requirements. Don't know yet, but it's just something flagging up for the future that may well be something that will come out of central government, because I think we can see that there is going to be a kind of major issue around the economy and how that does recover. So we shall see, and certainly in the kind of in food world, as I say, I think it is the kind of hospitality sector that has kind of really bore the brunt of the problems. The impact on local authority resources, I've already mentioned the fact that officers are being taken away from food work to deal with the COVID-19 business closure issues, but also with the economic issues coming in and businesses no longer being able to trade, if a local authority does have, business advice or primary authority partnerships, then an indirect impact may be that the ability to recover costs from primary authority partnerships may well be reduced as well. So in a way, it's a kind of not as an obvious impact as officers being pulled away to do other work, but there may well be other, perhaps more indirect impacts that the situation has that really don't help with the resources that we've got and potentially, what we can do around building resource as well. So, and I think quite a few authorities have kind of, if you have been charging for advice before, I think you've kind of maybe waived some of those cost recovery aspects of it. So again, it's not income, but it's just money that isn't going to be coming into the service. So it's just an awareness that there are other potential resource impacts as well as officers not being able to do food work. So as if we have enough to deal with COVID-19, clearly, and on the first slide of this, it's talking about EU exit, and from the messages coming from central government, there doesn't seem to be any potential for movement on the post-transition date. So to all intents and purposes, it looks like we will be exiting the transition period on the 31st of December. It will have an impact. We don't know exactly what the size and nature of that will be yet. So some of this is still speculation, but it's hopefully reasonably informed speculation. And as we'll see, as I kind of move on through the presentation, the end result is largely dependent upon things that haven't happened. So some of this could change, but it's kind of the best that we know of the situation at the moment. So hopefully you'll be aware of this. A few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now, CTSI put together a group of lead officers to deal with aspects of trading standards work that would be more directly affected, I think, by the departure from the EU, and produced this document. The web page on the CTSI website is kind of being updated. To be honest, it's been tweaking because reality is, since the decision or the referendum that decided we were to leave the EU, not a lot of substance has actually happened, to be fair. And so that document, although was written, put together a few years ago now, is still relevant, and things are maybe looking to be a little bit more resolved, but most of the information in that document is still relevant. So, if you are kind of wondering or having a think and you haven't read it, then, I would commend the document to you to have a look. It's a really good overview of the potential impacts and a realization that I think we all kind of know anyway, but it really brings home how much trading standards work is connected to EU derived legislation and guidance. So, and as I say, the website is being updated. Recently, DEFRA, there was kind of talk about a kind of transition guidance, and the link there to the website is very much around quite a reasonably detailed guide around use of things like organic symbols and other issues that are going to be directly and immediately affected by EU exit. Some things will happen straight away. So, for instance, the organic label, the guidance is, and I think it's mainly because it's kind of copyrighted by the EU. So from 1st of January, you won't be able to use the organic label. Other things like protected geographical indications will be affected as well, potentially around that protection. One of the parts that is actually a transition is that DEFRA have put in their guidance that the name and address, because once we leave the EU, as I'm sure all of you appreciate, one of the biggest changes will be the requirement for a name and address, because currently the EU legislation talks about a name and address of the food business in the EU. Clearly, when we leave the transition period, I'll say Great Britain, because we'll talk about Northern Ireland in a second, but Great Britain won't be part of that regime anymore. And so if you export to the EU, if you've got a name and address in Great Britain, that will no longer be legal for exporting to the EU. For goods coming into Great Britain, DEFRA has to, if you have an address in Ireland, then that will be permitted until the 30th of September 2022. So effectively what it's doing is giving businesses, and this is really as a result of the fact that there is so much uncertainty still around what is happening with trade deals, and I'll talk about it in a second, but because of the uncertainty, businesses just didn't have time to put things in place. And there's a kind of whole piece of work around businesses who export into the EU, setting up addresses and companies in the EU so that they could keep or have a name and address within the EU. But as we'll see in a second, what happens when goods go into the EU, we have no real influence over as things stand at the moment. But for goods coming into Great Britain, then DEFRA have issued the guidance that says, there will be this allowance. From 1st of October 2022, goods sold in Great Britain will need to have an address in the UK. And again, that's related to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So, but definitely worth having a look at that guidance if you've not looked at it already, because there is, it goes through quite a few different aspects of legislation that is directly influenced by or is directly relevant from the EU legislation. As part of the work of the Brexit think tank, we kind of tried to think about things that could be opportunities and, looking at it in a positive way. And one of the aspects we came up with was that it would be a chance to simplify the central government structure. So rather than having the Food Standards Agency, DEFRA, and Department of Health and Social Care looking after legislation that we deal with in regard to food standards, it would make far more sense to bring all of that back into the Food Standards Agency. And I think, as we said, the clue's in the name really, and it would make things far more cohesive and easier to deal with, because at the moment Food Standards Agency is a non-ministerial department. DEFRA and Department of Health and Social Care are, so they do have different ways of dealing with policy, they do have different processes, and trying to deal with them is you do have to approach it in slightly different ways, which isn't helpful. They do liaise, to be fair. It's not about the people, it's about the structure. They do liaise, talk to each other and try to make sure that there is consistency, but I think it's the ministerial input that sometimes means that things perhaps happen in a way that you think, well, actually, is that the best way to go? Also an opportunity maybe for trading standards to build on maybe business advice, because it could be a chance to actually show businesses that, I think businesses who have dealt with us in the past realise that, we do try to find solutions. It's not just about stopping people doing things. It's about saying, well, if you can't do it like this, maybe you can do it like that. And maybe for businesses who are still, they've got that barrier around, well, I don't want to talk to a regulator because I don't want to necessarily hear what they've got to say. Might be an opportunity to show them that actually, we do look for solutions most of the time, not ways of stopping things happening. Also an opportunity to amend legislation. So where there are things that maybe we've accepted as a compromise because of the nature of the EU process, it's an opportunity to perhaps look at changes for the domestic market. Clearly, if you're exporting to the EU, this is irrelevant because you've got to comply with the EU legislation. So this is purely for kind of domestic market purposes. And there's a link to the think tank document. Number of concerns. We don't know, as I've touched upon, don't know how member states will deal with our exports. We just don't know. How will the UK systems work? That's becoming a little bit clearer. For things like nutrition and health claims and for novel food applications in particular, there is, or people have been appointed to the relevant bodies to consider those claims. As I understand it, I think there is still a little bit of uncertainty about what the actual process is. And again, as we get closer to 31st of December, and this kind of links in with CBD issues I'll talk about later on. But if you're looking to try to get a novel food approved, at the moment for a business, it's quite a difficult decision whether to go for EU approval or look at UK. What the FSA have said is that if you apply to the EFSA through the EFSA system, if you contact the FSA and let them know what's happening, then that may well enable them to perhaps pick up the application if it's not been dealt with before or by the 31st of December this year. So again, businesses, it's useful to stay in contact with the FSA and just let them know what's happening. Again, people have been appointed to the bodies, but we still aren't too sure about what the actual mechanisms are to deal with that. The impact trade deals have on our standards. Well, yeah, we've had the Japanese deal, which to be honest doesn't really, I don't think has a huge impact. Clearly, most of the news has been around, a possible trade deal with America. We still, well, I don't think we do anyway. We still don't know what's happening there really. And so you kind of get the impression, if Donald Trump wins, it could be chlorinated chicken. If Joe Biden wins, it may be that we don't get any kind of deal at all. So it's uncertainty and we just don't know what's going to happen. And in relation to the impact, the government, and again, for those of you who've been following it, the agriculture bill currently was called for it to have a clause in there which effectively in law protected the kind of food standards and animal welfare standards that we've currently got. The government have said they want to protect them, but aren't prepared to put that into law. So what they've done is set up this thing called the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which has got a number of representatives from different bodies, including the NFU. And their role apparently is to look at potential trade deals and advise the government as to what impact that could have on food standards and animal welfare standards. They don't have any legal powers, I think, to do anything if they don't, but the government have said because it's a legally established body, they have more influence than if they weren't. But we'll see what happens with that. Must admit, I'm a bit skeptical, to be quite honest, because they can advise, but if there's a really good trade deal on the table and there has to be compromise, I suspect that it may well be the trade deal that wins rather than the standards, but I could be proved wrong, but we'll see. As I said there, a lot of uncertainty. We don't have a trade deal yet with the European Union. The immovable deadlines have been moved several times, and we are still in a position where I think we're kind of looking at mid-November, I think, as the next final deadline. So we'll see what happens. And if we get a deal, that will potentially have an impact on some of the things that we've talked about already with regard to how easily goods are able to kind of move in and out of Europe into Britain as well, and also what compromises are made around standards and etc. So we'll see. Until we get the detail, if we get a deal, it's quite difficult to kind of give any huge pieces of information about that. So it's really just watch this space, and we will try to get stuff out as soon as we know what's happening, just to hopefully help people, because for businesses, generally speaking, businesses hate uncertainty, and this is just we've got to a point now where any kind of changes they will need some kind of support and ability to perhaps have stuff on the marketplace that isn't quite compliant. But again, we'll need to deal with that as we move along, liaising with central government. One of the concerns is that potentially, again, because things are being left until very late in the day, you know, from not knowing what's going to happen, suddenly we'll probably know what's going to happen, and then understandably there'll probably be a huge flood of questions about what can happen and what can't. So again, we're sort of a little bit concerned about our ability to deal with all those queries in the timescales that we would like to. So devolution issues, mentioned those because again, for those of you who've been kind of looking at it, the internal markets bill has caused real issues, and in theory, really good idea around making sure that trade between England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland is as smooth as can be, because food standards is a devolved issue. Therefore, Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland can make slightly different legislation. Previously, the EU umbrella helped to prevent things being too diverse, but now that's gone. It will be a case of saying, well, you know, if Wales and Scotland want to go separate ways in certain ways. So, and things like the, I know it's not food, but it kind of relates to food. The alcohol unit pricing in Scotland is an example where maybe the nations divert. Sorry, I'll just move my cat. There you go. But to try to avoid that, the government proposed this idea of a commission to examine potential new legislation and make comments around whether or not they thought it was okay. In theory, sounds really good, but I think from a Scottish Welsh point of view, they kind of see it as effectively taking away their devolved powers, because, you know, what they're saying is, well, we want the ability to do that, but this commission potentially is just going to say, well, no, you can't do that because it diverges too far from the English rules, therefore. So there's a whole argument about that, and that's still kind of unresolved, really, and we'll see how that goes. But potentially, if the internal market bill does get passed, there could be some real political issues coming up in the near future. The other concern is potential for food fraud, because border controls potentially will be relaxed for the first 6 months. That's the message that the government are putting out. Therefore, you know, will that mean that people will try to get food that isn't what it says it is across into Great Britain? It's an opportunity. And also access to intelligence. At the moment, we potentially don't have access to some of the databases and some of the coordination that we have with Europe at the moment. So again, this could be potentially dealt with through a trade deal, but if not, we will lose a significant access to information and intelligence. So it's kind of something that hopefully a trade deal, if we get one, could deal with. So that's kind of dealing with where we are, I think, with the post-transition period. There are lots of other kind of potential issues, but as I say, until we start to get more detail, it's quite difficult to give concrete answers to some questions. But the DEFRA document is definitely worth a look. Other regulatory issues. This is just a kind of rag bag of things that I thought, you know, it's worth just being aware of if you aren't already. The first one, the lockdown and the COVID-19 situation, not just in the food sector, but so generally has seen a growth in e-commerce. And I think that it's something that as a kind of profession, we've been struggling with for a number of years now. And it really is about how we deal with this growth of e-commerce. And, you know, do we need to look at how we work? I touched upon it earlier with, you know, the Food Standards Agency saying that perhaps remote interventions, looking at websites, taking sampling via mail order, that kind of thing. Are these ways that we can deal with e-commerce? Because, you know, it is more difficult because you aren't dealing with bricks and mortar. So if you get a complaint about a website, sometimes it's just not as easy to deal with as dealing with a retail premise, because, you know, if you can go and see them or ring them or get in contact with them and actually, you know, just do a kind of face-to-face, even if it's virtually, that can at least enable you to make that connection. But with e-commerce, there are lots of issues that I think we in the coming years, we need to kind of look at how we work, how we're structured, what skill sets that we have, and just really look at how we deal with that whole kind of market sector, because it is growing. It's not going to go away. And sadly, when you look at some of the high streets these days, the retail premises probably will still have a part to play, but their kind of function and profile will probably change. Leaving the EU, I guess connected to that is the increased need for market surveillance, because a lot of the work that goes on at EU level around market surveillance, we won't be able to do anymore. The FSA have already funded some sampling programs to look at potential issues relating to different foodstuffs. But again, it's a kind of slight concern that, will we have the resource if the FSA aren't able to carry on with that funding? Will local authorities see that as a role? Because if it's a potentially national impact, will local authorities see that as something that maybe should be directed and supported and coordinated nationally? I think it's a fair argument, and that's certainly something that we'd be looking for from a kind of CTSI point of view. It makes sense, because local authorities just don't have the capacity or resource to look at that kind of national level. I mentioned already the reduced access to intelligence. That's mainly around the kind of EU side of it, but potentially with the kind of devolved nation issues as well. Will there be coordination there? Now, ABC, Achieving Business Compliance. The Regulating Our Future programme that the FSA are running around looking at how food standards and food hygiene work is delivered has now kind of morphed into, I think it's phase 2, which is being called Achieving Business Compliance. And there is a kind of developed a new risk scheme, which certainly for food standards, I think is more fit for purpose and really reflects the risk that the food business poses to the market, rather than concentrating on a premise or a physical aspect of it. And to me, that makes, we've just been talking about e-commerce. The person sat at home ordering stuff on the computer, could be anything, could be food, could be hair dryers, could be whatever. The traditional risk assessment doesn't really deal with them particularly well. So what we're looking for, and what we've kind of worked with the FSA on, is a risk scheme that I think really addresses the potential threats to the marketplace moving forward, and really will enable us to do interventions that we feel are more relevant, because certainly sometimes the current risk scheme does result in visits to food businesses who you kind of think actually they've got really good systems, and the fact that they're a manufacturer, well, why does that mean they are potentially higher risk? So at the moment, unfortunately, the pilot projects with 20 authorities, I think 12 of whom were going to use the new scheme, 8 were going to be control services, just to kind of been able to compare data. They've been delayed now until at least January. Hopefully that will kind of enable, or we'll be able to kind of get on with those. And I must admit, kind of to give credit to the FSA where it's due, they do want to do these pilots for a year, so they get a good set of data to look at and really kind of assess what seems to be working and what doesn't. And I think it'll be really interesting. And I'm hopeful that looking forward, it will mean that we can deliver food standards interventions in a way that is more suited to the way the marketplace is developing, but also hopefully try to secure resource from local authorities, because we can show that we are looking at good outcomes rather than just delivering numbers. So hopeful for that. Sampling, an issue. Public analysts are kind of rapidly disappearing. Really difficult issue, but sampling has got to be an essential part of food standards work. And again, it's really trying to hang on to the resource that we've got, trying to make sure that we can try to build on that. And again, working with the FSA to really try to build that, and looking at what the FSA can do to support it. And it's kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit, but we are very aware of that and want to carry on developing that work. Pre-pack for direct sale and allergen information, I mention it because The new legislation will come into force 1st of October next year. The FSA did a promotional campaign 1st of October this year, just to kind of put it out there. But again, real challenges for potentially smaller businesses, real challenges for local authorities, because they're the ones who perhaps need most support. But clearly a really important piece of work, and something that, you know, we need to be aware of and really, I guess, start to put the building blocks in place for how we're going to deal with that. We've already mentioned aggregators and fulfillment houses. Just Eat, Deliveroo, Uber, etc., and the issues that they have and what responsibility they have for the food that they deliver. You know, what can that expectation be? And we're still kind of really trying to bottom out what that means. Fulfillment houses, we are still looking at them. There is an item, we've got a food standards and information focus group meeting on the 12th. Fulfillment houses is on the agenda, and it's something that we're really keen to try to get a more definitive opinion. There is an opinion relating to more product safety that NTS, I think, got from council a while back, but because of the slight difference in the wording of the food law, we really wanted to try to get an opinion or guidance from central government about, you know, their opinion about what responsibility a fulfillment house has. Because to be quite honest, I think it's like you know, Just Eat and Deliveroo, they don't see themselves as food businesses, so they don't really fit within the kind of traditional framework of the legislation and the definitions. So it's really trying to fit innovative ways of kind of doing business into existing legislation. But to do that, we need some really kind of good guidance and an agreed opinion from central government that we can then work with. CBD regulation. FSA clarified the position. CBD or CBD oil products and ingredients will need to be approved under the novel food regime. They've indicated to businesses that this will need to be in place before the 31st of March next year. And I think that is really, you know, they've got an application in place and it is being processed. So if a business hasn't done that, then 1st of April 2021, the products will not be legal. And we've got various enforcement regulatory tools in the novel food regulations to deal with them, you know, ranging from fixed penalty notices through to stop selling orders, through to the novel foods regulations, potentially offer a real kind of diverse range of ways of dealing with this issue. So, and again, we're talking about this at the focus group next week, really around kind of expectations and, you know, what enforcement approach the FSA would feel comfortable with. I mentioned the obesity strategy. Again, go back to COVID-19. This kind of came out, I think, of COVID-19. Obesity strategy has kind of withered on the vine recently, but then I think there was a realization that COVID-19 had an impact on people who were were kind of obese at a higher level than people who weren't. So that seemed to produce a level of activity. We've seen the strategy in terms of practical application. We haven't really seen that much coming out of it yet, but it's a kind of watch this space. Part of it, though, is, I guess, the calorie labelling in catering establishments requirement that will be coming in. And we've been talking to Department of Health and Social Care about how that can be enforced and what type of enforcement they're looking for. And initially, they seem to be saying, well, you know, it really is about checking they've got the information there, but also looking at how they've got that. So a number of issues to unpack there, but there is ongoing work on that, and there will be guidance coming out around that when the regulations do sort of finalise. On hold health claims, I mention these because when we leave the EU, sitting within the EU is I think it's about 1,500 claims that have just been put on hold because EFSA haven't been able to deal with them. And Department of Health and Social Care aim is to ask for calls for evidence and try to deal with them so that I think the aim is by September next year to have dealt with as many of the on-hold claims as we can. Until then, I think the guidance is that they can continue to be used, but you know, food businesses will need to be putting in evidence to get them looked at and potentially approved through the system that will be the UK system. I mentioned the use by date case. That was the Tesco case where they appealed against a prosecution by Birmingham on the basis that they had to prove that the food was unsafe after being sold after the use by date. After the Torfan case, which was based on the old set of regulations, this came up under the new regulations, but the court said, actually, no, it's a deemed fact that if a food is sold after its use by date, it's unsafe. You don't have to prove it's unsafe, which kind of is the position that we were with Torfan. So that's just reinforced that. And then I think Tesco was subsequently prosecuted by Bracknell Forest, I think, for more use by date offences after that. So it's quite interesting. I've mentioned this already, really. Future government approach to regulation, you know, are we looked at as a positive way of dealing with the marketplace, or, you know, red tape? And I think it's a discussion to be had. The constant innovation in the sector is a constant challenge. You know, it's good, but it just means that sometimes the legislation gets left behind, and, you know, we have to mould definitions to things that it wasn't really intended for. And then really fitting in with the first point on that slide, you know, funding post-COVID and EU exit. You know, we've been spending a lot of money. How's that going to be got back? Are local authorities going to be invested in, or, you know, are we seen as a way of saving money? Don't know. So I'll just throw those out there as don't want to depress people too much. Sorry to end on a sort of low note on that slide. Just mention these. Hopefully you'll be aware of these. Food Standards and Information Focus Group, that's the regional representatives. The route through that, if you've got a query, is talk to your regional group. If it can't be agreed, they can then refer it through to the focus group, who will look at it and come up with an opinion. Most of those end up being AXO badged, so, you know, gives it a little bit of gives it a bit more weight, I guess. Business Expert Group is a kind of parallel group to the focus group, consists of trade association members, and yeah, we work with them developing opinions just to get a kind of business input on an opinion. And then obviously Primary Authority and the various groups around that. I mentioned CTSI, obviously, FSA, DEFRA, Department of Health and Social Care for guidance. And then also I mentioned the Nutrition and Health Claims Compliance Roundtable, which is a group consisting of trade associations, the FSA, MHRA, ourselves, CTSI, and it looks at the kind of, we've been aware that there is a gap in nutrition and health claims enforcement for a number of years, unless there is fraud involved. So they're trying to deal with the maybe lower level non-compliances. But I put something on the Knowledge Hub about the compliance roundtable, and I would kind of urge you to have a look at that, because if you've got a question, if the food business is a member of a trade association, you know, those trade associations are really keen to help us bring them back into compliance. So, you know, worth a look, and especially where we are all kind of hard pressed with time, often they can help with interpretation. So as I say, there's an entry on the Knowledge Hub about that. And that's it. Sorry, I've overrun slightly. I said 45 minutes, but I've talked a bit too much, but I'll end the presentation there and just